She laughed at my dress, my daughter on her wedding day. Right there in front of everyone, she pointed at the pale blue satin I'd worn, the same one I wore to my own wedding, the one I'd hand-altered for this day, and said, "Oh my God, Mom, did you dig that out of a thrift store?" People chuckled. Her bridesmaids giggled behind their champagne flutes. Even her soon-to-be mother-in-law smirked. I stood there clutching my small silver clutch like a life raft. I felt my cheeks flush, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't ask her how she could say that, knowing full well I had paid for nearly every part of this wedding, from the dress on her back to the music playing in the background. Instead, I just smiled, a small, steady smile that didn't reach my eyes, and then I picked up my phone. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before all of this, before the laughter, the humiliation, the phone call that changed everything, my life was small, quiet, and full of purpose. My name is Linda, and I raised my daughter, Sophie, on my own since she was 6. My husband Daniel passed away after a brutal battle with pancreatic cancer. It was quick and cruel. One day, we were sitting together at the kitchen table planning our trip to Maine, and the next, I was holding his hand while machines beeped around us and nurses whispered in the hallway. After he passed, I didn't just lose my husband. I lost my anchor, but I had Sophie. And in those first few months after the funeral, it was her small, trembling voice saying, "It's okay, Mommy," that kept me going. We were inseparable, like two islands trying to rebuild into one. I worked as a tailor out of our modest home, piecing together wedding gowns, prom dresses, and church suits for the women in our neighborhood. It didn't bring in much, but it was steady. Every dollar went to the essentials: rent, groceries, and eventually Sophie's college fund. She was always a bright girl, ambitious, sharp. She used to sit beside me while I sewed, pretending to take client calls. "Yes, Miss Linda's Designs. How can I help you?" she'd say in a sing-gong voice. We had dinners together every night, soup on Mondays, pasta on Thursdays, breakfast for dinner on Fridays because it was fun. I saved every card she made me, every crayon drawing, every best mom ever note tucked into my apron pocket when she thought I wasn't looking. When she got accepted into university, I cried for an hour straight, not because I was sad, but because we did it. I remember sitting across from the admissions officer, watching Sophie shake his hand with that confident grin of hers and feeling like all the years of scraping by had been worth it. She moved out at 18 and never really came back. At first, it was natural. She was busy building a life, interning for an event management company in the city. Then, it turned into texts instead of calls. Holidays shortened, birthdays missed. I didn't complain. I didn't want to be one of those mothers who guilt-tripped her daughter for chasing her dreams. I wanted to be proud. When she told me she was getting married to Ethan, a financial advisor from her firm, I felt joy and loss all at once. She FaceTimed me from her apartment, practically glowing, waving her left hand like a trophy. "He proposed at the top of the Ferris wheel," she said, her eyes shining. "Can you believe it?" I nodded, smiling through the screen. "Of course I can. He'd be a fool not to." The next day, she called back and said something I'll never forget. "Mom, I want you to be part of everything." And I believed her. I was there when she picked out the venue, a beautiful vineyard on the outskirts of town with hanging lanterns and whitewashed barn walls. I wrote the deposit check. I was there when she tried on her first dress, when her eyes welled up and she turned to me and said, "It's perfect." I offered to pay. "It's your day," I told her. "No compromises." Every step of the way, I gave more than I had. Time, money, emotion, not because I expected thanks, but because I wanted her to feel everything I never got to feel when I was her age. I wanted her to be celebrated, cherished, surrounded by beauty. I even started sewing a new dress for myself, not because I couldn't buy one, but because I wanted to wear something with meaning, something handmade, like love stitched into every seam. I used the same pattern from my wedding dress, adjusted for time and age, and added a soft blue satin that reminded me of spring skies and Sunday mornings. Sophie said nothing when I showed her, just gave a quick glance and said, Nice. I brushed it off. She was stressed after all. Brides always are. I didn't want to be the problem. I didn't want to be a burden. Looking back, maybe that was my mistake. I mistook silence for respect, distance for maturity. I thought I was doing what mothers are supposed to do. Give everything and expect nothing. But now I wonder, did she ever really see me? Because the woman she mocked at her wedding wasn't just wearing an old dress. She was wearing 30 years of love, sacrifice, and silence. And that woman had finally had enough. It was a Thursday in March when I noticed it. A faint flicker, a shift in the way she spoke to me. Sophie had invited me into the city for a wedding dress fitting. She wanted to try on one last gown before making the final decision. "You'll love this one," she'd said over the phone. "It's got that vintage vibe you always go on about." I took the early train, packed a small lunch in my bag, and wore a cardigan she'd gifted me for my birthday the year before. When I arrived, the boutique was gleaming and minimalist, the kind of place where everything smelled like eucalyptus and money. A young woman with a clipboard greeted me. "Are you the financial contact for Miss Sophie?" I blinked. "I'm her mother." The girl smiled, unbothered. "Of course. Right this way." Sophie emerged from behind a velvet curtain in a sleek, modern gown. Nothing vintage about it. It hugged her figure and sparkled under the overhead lights. She looked stunning. "Wow," I said softly, genuinely. "That's breathtaking, honey." She turned toward the mirror, admiring herself from every angle. Then, without looking at me, she said to the stylist, "Don't worry, she's not wearing that dress she showed me. We'll get her something more appropriate." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, that blue thing. Mom, it's a wedding, not a costume party," I laughed, though it didn't come out quite right. "It's just a dress. I was going to alter it more." The stylist, clearly unsure of how to respond, cleared her throat and changed the subject. But the moment lingered. I sat on the plush bench by the mirror, watching my daughter twirl. She looked so grown, so composed, but something in her eyes had gone hard. On the train ride home, I kept thinking about it, the words, the tone. It wasn't what she said, but how easily she dismissed me, like I was a footnote in a story she was trying to rewrite. Still, I told myself not to overreact. Every bride gets a little sharp under pressure. Maybe she hadn't meant it that way. Maybe I was being too sensitive. After all, she'd always had strong opinions. She got that from her father, and I'd always been the type to avoid conflict, to keep the peace. But the next week, the red flag turned a deeper shade. We were finalizing the seating chart in her apartment. Well, she was finalizing it. I was there to help, which mostly meant nodding along while she clicked through spreadsheets. Ethan was there too, half listening while scrolling on his phone. I noticed something odd. My table, the one where I'd be seated, was in the far corner away from the bridal party near the entrance to the kitchen. I pointed to it. "Tess, is this where you want me?" She barely looked up. "It's just logistics. We need to keep the immediate family tables close to the dance floor." I frowned. "But I'm immediate family." She hesitated. "Well, Ethan's parents are hosting a lot of out-of-town guests, and it made sense to arrange it this way." It stung. Not because I needed to be the center of attention, but because I'd assumed I'd be close enough to see her smile, to hear the vows, not tucked away like an afterthought. Still, I didn't argue. I said, "Of course, whatever you need." She smiled then, in a way that made me feel more like a helpful vendor than a mother. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my sewing machine, running my hands over the fabric of my dress. The blue satin felt different, colder. I didn't touch the needle. I just sat there, letting the silence answer the questions I didn't want to ask. Something had shifted. I could feel it, and even though I tried to pretend otherwise, I knew deep down this wedding wasn't about celebrating us. It was about showcasing her. I was no longer part of the picture she wanted to paint, just the woman holding the frame. The little moments began to chip away at me. Not all at once. It wasn't some grand betrayal. Not yet. It was subtle, almost polite. That's what made it so hard to name. I noticed I'd stopped being mom and had become Linda. not in affection, but in the tone people use when they're filing paperwork or referencing someone they've outgrown. Sophie would say it when she was confirming payments with vendors. Linda's handling that. Or at the cake tasting when Ethan's sister asked who was organizing the finances. She laughed and said, "Oh, my mom. She's old school. She still balances a checkbook." Everyone chuckled. I smiled too, even though I hadn't used a checkbook in years. I manage my business from a sleek little laptop I bought myself 2 Christmases ago. Thank you very much. It was like she had carefully plucked me from the warm, sturdy nest we'd built and set me on a shelf, a quiet exhibit of maternal sacrifice, best viewed at a distance. If I offered an opinion, it was brushed off with, "We already have someone handling that." If I asked a question, she would blink slowly and say, "Mom, this is how things are done now." I wasn't asking to run the show. I just wanted to feel like I belonged in it. The clincher came during the florist meeting. We were sitting in a sunlit showroom surrounded by sample arrangements. Sophie was explaining her vision: neutral tones, lots of eucalyptus, no bright old-fashioned colors. The florist, a kind woman named Raina, turned to me and asked, "Will you be carrying a corsage or bouquet?" Before I could answer, Sophie cut in, "Oh no, she's not part of the processional." The room fell quiet for a moment. Raina gave me a sympathetic glance, but I shook my head quickly and smiled. "Of course not," I said. "I'll be in the audience watching proudly." But the truth was, I hadn't known that. I'd assumed, maybe foolishly, that I'd walk in with someone, be part of that moment, even if just quietly. I wasn't expecting center stage. I just thought there would be a role for me, something more than the woman who signed the checks. Later that night, I sat at home with a cup of tea and stared at the corsage I'd already ordered for myself. Soft lilac roses, a nod to my own wedding bouquet. I designed it in secret, telling myself it would be my little joy in the midst of the whirlwind. Now it felt like a silly indulgence, a child's crayon drawing brought to a boardroom meeting. Even Ethan, whom I'd always gotten along with, began to speak to me like I was fragile. "Don't worry, Linda," he said one afternoon when I asked about the shuttle buses. "We've got it all under control." Then he patted my hand. My hand. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't respectful either. That's what wore me down. The slow, persistent stripping away of my place, my presence, the way they turned me into a relic, a ghost, a checkbook with a pulse. I started spending less time in the city. When Sophie would text, it was always about a deposit, a delivery, a deadline. Rarely, if ever, "How are you, Mom?" or "Want to have lunch?" I didn't push back. I didn't want to add to her stress. That's what I told myself, but the truth was harder to swallow. I didn't want to find out that maybe, just maybe, my daughter had already decided I wasn't important to this new chapter of her life. The dress I'd been sewing remained half-finished on my mannequin. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Every time I walked past it, it felt like walking past a memory I wasn't allowed to keep. I started keeping a small notebook, not a journal. I've never been the Dear Diary type, just notes, observations, fragments. I wrote down every moment that made me pause. The seating chart, the dress comments, the way Sophie started to call me Linda. I didn't know why I was keeping track. Maybe I was trying to convince myself that I wasn't imagining it, that it was real, that something precious was slipping through my fingers, and I needed proof it had ever been there to begin with. Or maybe I already knew what was coming, and I needed a way to hold on to myself before I disappeared completely. The rehearsal dinner was held at a charming Italian restaurant tucked into the edge of the city, the kind of place with soft lighting, white linen tablecloths, and waiters who remembered your name by the end of the night. It should have been a celebration, a warm, laughter-filled evening to cap off all the stress and planning. But for me, it became a moment I would never forget, and not for the reasons I'd hoped. I had spent the entire day helping with final preparations, picking up place cards, checking in with the shuttle company, and making sure the hotel rooms for the out-of-town guests were properly arranged. Sophie hadn't asked me to do these things, not directly, but when I offered, she gave me the kind of nod people give when they're trying not to say, "Fine, Just go do it. So I did gladly, because that's what mothers do. I arrived at the restaurant early. I wanted to look nice, to feel like I belonged. I wore the same dress I'd been working on for weeks, a pale blue hand-altered piece from my own wedding day, adjusted with fresh lace around the sleeves and stitched with care and precision. It wasn't modern. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. It was mine. I stepped into the private dining room, took a breath, and smiled at the familiar faces. Family members, friends, a few people I'd barely recognized from Sophie's life in the city. Everyone was already seated. I stood near the door for a few moments, unsure where to go. Eventually, Sophie waved me over. "Mom, there's a seat over there," she said, pointing to the far end of the table near the waiter station. I walked past her and Ethan, past their friends and bridal party until I reached the chair by the pitch of water. No one looked up. No one greeted me. I sat down slowly, the edges of my smile beginning to fray. Then, just before dessert was served, Sophie stood and tapped her glass with a fork. "I just want to thank everyone for being here," she began. "Tomorrow's the big day, and I couldn't have done any of this without the support of so many amazing people, especially Ethan, who's been my rock, and his family, who welcomed me like one of their own." Everyone clapped. She went on to thank her bridesmaids, her event coordinator, and even Ethan's teenage cousin, who ran an errand for her when she was too busy to breathe. People laughed, toasts were raised. She didn't mention me, not once. I thought, maybe she's saving it for the end. Maybe there's something special coming. But instead, she turned to me with a smirk, not cruel, just casual, like someone sharing an inside joke, and said, "And Mom, I see you wore the dress." The way she said it made everyone look, heads turned, cameras flashed. "It's kind of legendary in our family," she added, laughing. "She wore it to her own wedding and every church function since." Her bridesmaids snickered. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head like he was enduring a charming embarrassment. I froze. The room, warm just a minute ago, felt suddenly sharp with quiet amusement. I glanced down at my dress, the one I'd sewn, the one I'd poured so many memories into, and felt my body turn cold. She wasn't complimenting me. She was putting me on display, making me the punchline. I forced a laugh, a small one, the kind you give when the joke is about you and you don't want to ruin the mood. The waiter brought dessert, and the conversation moved on just like that. But I didn't move on. I sat there staring at the tiny tiramisu in front of me untouched. The lace at my sleeves itched suddenly, like it no longer belonged to me. The dress felt heavier than it had all night. I stayed until the end of the dinner. I smiled in the group photos. I hugged Ethan's grandmother and said she looked beautiful. I complimented the flowers. I even thanked the staff before leaving. Then once I was outside, I sat alone in my car in the restaurant parking lot for 20 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat in the dark. The fabric of my dress bunched beneath the seatbelt, wondering when exactly my daughter had stopped seeing me as someone to honor and started seeing me as someone to manage, or worse, to mock. That was the moment something inside me began to break, and quietly, without drama or announcement, I started to change. The morning of the wedding, I woke early. I had barely slept, my body tense with thoughts that refused to quiet. The dress hung on the back of the closet door, that same pale blue piece now carrying a weight it hadn't held before. It had once been a symbol of love and memory, a link to the past I had treasured. Now it felt like a costume I'd been forced to wear in a play where I was cast as the fool. Still, I ironed it slowly, deliberately. There's something about caring for fabric that soothes the soul even when it's breaking. As the steam rose from the iron, I kept telling myself, today is about her. Don't ruin it. Don't make it about you. When I arrived at the venue, no one greeted me. Guests milled about. The photographer was snapping pictures of the bridal party on the lawn. Sophie stood at the center, radiant and composed, surrounded by soft ivory dresses and matching smiles. Her back was to me. She didn't turn around. I stood there for a few seconds before one of the planners, a young woman named Brooke, spotted me. "Oh, you're here," she said. The mother of the bride, right? I nodded. Let me take you to your seat. The ceremony starts soon. Not the bridal suite, not a moment with my daughter, just my seat like any other guest. I followed her through the side entrance, down a hallway filled with scattered flower boxes and cables, and into the main hall. The seats were arranged in perfect rows. Mine was 3 from the back, right next to a drafty window and far from the altar. I sat down quietly, adjusting my purse in my lap, and waited. I told myself it was fine, that it wasn't personal, that the venue probably made the arrangements, that Sophie had too much going on to notice something so small. But in my heart, I knew none of that was true. The ceremony began. The music swelled. People rose to their feet. I stayed seated a beat longer than everyone else, watching as my daughter walked down the aisle on Ethan's father's arm. Not mine. There it was, the final confirmation. I wasn't part of her story anymore. When the vows were exchanged and applause filled the room, I clapped too, gently, mechanically, and when the officiant declared them husband and wife, I smiled. But inside, something had gone still. After the ceremony, guests filtered out into the courtyard for champagne and canapes. I stood to the side, watching from a distance as Sophie and Ethan posed for photos. Someone passed a glass of bubbly into my hand, and I pretended to sip it. I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt like vanishing. The final straw came when I overheard a group of Sophie's friends talking near the hors d'oeuvres table. I heard, her mom canceled the dress fittings twice. Maybe she's embarrassed. No, she just has that weird homemade one, right? She's kind of intense. They didn't know I was behind them, or maybe they didn't care. Either way, it didn't matter. I heard enough. I set my glass down, walked inside, past the waiters, past the seating chart, past the framed engagement photos. I found a quiet hallway near the back of the venue, pulled out my phone, and opened my email. I stared at the screen, hesitating only for a second, then opened the catering invoice. The balance hadn't yet been finalized. I called the company. Hi, this is Linda Jennings. I need to cancel today's final delivery. Yes, I understand the contract. No, there's no backup vendor. That's fine. Please confirm via email. The woman on the other end hesitated. Are you sure, ma'am? I'm sure. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't pettiness. It was the realization that I had allowed myself to fund an entire celebration where I had been reduced to nothing more than a wallet, and if I was going to be invisible, then I would choose where I disappeared. I stepped outside and took one last look at the venue, at my daughter, at the people laughing, sipping champagne, unaware of the shift that had just occurred. Then I turned and walked to my car. Not in anger, but in silence. A silence I had earned. I didn't go home right away. I didn't even know where I was driving at first. I just needed to get away from that vineyard, from the chatter and the music and the illusion that this day had anything to do with love. I ended up at an old rest stop about 40 minutes out of town, one of those quiet, faded places tucked between 2 long stretches of highway. There was a single vending machine humming beside the building and a row of crooked picnic benches out back, half covered in dappled afternoon sunlight. I parked beneath the shade of a leaning oak tree and sat in the car with the engine off, the windows down. The silence was deafening. I reached for the brooch pinned to my dress, a delicate piece of silver and mother of pearl that used to belong to Ethan's mother. He had given it to me on our wedding day, fastened it to my dress with a clumsy kind of tenderness I'd never forgotten. It was the only part of him I brought to Sophie's wedding. I unpinned it now, slowly, carefully, just stared at it, resting in my palm. I whispered to the empty car, I wish you'd been there today, Richard. Maybe you would have known what to say. I sat like that for a long time, a statue in pale blue satin, hair done up, makeup smudged slightly from the heat, from the strain. I was supposed to be celebrating, toasting, holding my daughter's hand. Instead, I was a woman in a parking lot, too embarrassed to cry, too hollow to scream. The weight of the last few months came crashing down all at once, not in a tidal wave, but like a slow flood rising up around my ankles. I thought of the seating chart, the dress comments, the way my name had been left off every thank you, the way I had funded nearly every inch of that wedding, only to be positioned like an afterthought. It wasn't the money. It had never been about the money. It was about being erased, being made invisible in a moment that should have honored everything I had given. I reached into my purse for a tissue and instead pulled out an old receipt, one of the many from the caterer marked "paid in full." The numbers stared back at me like accusations. $8,492.73. I had been willing to give all that and more, not because I had to, but because I wanted my daughter to feel loved, to be surrounded by joy. And she had taken that gift, not just the money, but my presence, my effort, and twisted it into something cheap. I felt shame deep and awful, not because I'd walked away, but because I had stayed so long, because I had waited and waited for her to see me, the real me. And she never did. I got out of the car and walked toward the picnic benches. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, throwing long amber shadows across the wooden planks. I sat down at the furthest table, placing my purse beside me. There were ants crawling along the edges. Leaves rustled gently in the trees above. A truck passed in the distance, low and slow. I watched it disappear into the horizon and whispered to no one. What now? For the first time in a long time, I didn't have an answer. I had spent nearly 3 decades giving, stitching together a life from scraps and love, holding things together with patience and prayer. And now, at the end of it, I was alone. No husband, no daughter, just a memory of both. One buried in the ground, the other buried beneath years of quiet resentment and polished wedding decor. I stayed there until the shadows stretched long enough to blur the lines between day and night. Then I rose, dusted the crumbs off my skirt, and walked back to the car. Not because I had a plan, not yet, but because even at my lowest, even at rock bottom, I still knew how to stand. When I got home that evening, the house was dim, not dark. I hadn't forgotten to leave the porch light on, but dim in a way that felt heavier than usual. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was cavernous, like something had been carved out of me and left unfilled. I slipped off my shoes by the door and walked through the hallway slowly, passing all the markers of the life I had lived here. The framed photos, the antique mirror Richard's parents had gifted us, the coat rack that leaned slightly from years of use. I didn't go to bed right away. I couldn't. My body felt too wired with sadness to rest, and my heart too full of questions to find peace. Instead, I walked into my sewing room. It was the one room in the house that never changed. Same thread jars lined up by color. Same fabric bolts tucked into the corner shelf. Same vintage Singer machine resting under its plastic dust cover. It smelled like linen and time. I pulled off the cover, ran my fingers along the metal plate, and sat down in the creaky chair that had molded to the shape of my body over the years. I didn't cry. I just sat still, listening, breathing. Then, without really knowing why, I opened the bottom drawer of my old work desk, the drawer I hadn't touched in months, maybe even a year. Inside was a worn shoebox, gray, unmarked, no label, just a faint ring where something had once spilled on the lid. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the sewing table. It took me a moment to lift the lid, as if doing so might release all the air that had been stuck inside me since the wedding. Inside, neatly stacked, were years of little things I'd saved and forgotten. A clay handprint Sophie made in kindergarten, a crumpled napkin with her first attempt at cursive writing, a dried flower from the bouquet she gave me after her first recital. Photos, too. Not of events, but of moments. Sophie, sitting cross-legged in the grass, her arms around a puppy. Sophie, holding a snow globe and laughing so hard her eyes were squeezed shut. A candid photo Richard had taken of us baking cookies in the kitchen, both of us covered in flour and smiling like the world was perfect. At the bottom of the box was a letter folded carefully, my name written across the front in purple glitter pen. I recognized her handwriting immediately. She must have been around 10 when she wrote it, maybe younger. I opened it slowly. Dear Mom, I love you more than the moon and the stars and the whole entire sky. When I grow up, I want to be like you because you make everything okay. You always smile, even when you're tired, and you always make my pancakes into hearts. You give the best hugs and the best advice. I hope I never forget how much I love you. Love, Sophie. Peace. When I get married, you have to wear your pretty blue dress. You look like a queen in it. I read the letter 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to absorb every word like sunlight on a cold day. I pressed it to my chest and exhaled for the first time in what felt like weeks. She had loved me once, not just out of obligation, not because I provided or cooked or cleaned or stitched dresses, but because I was her safe place, because for a time I had been her world, and somewhere along the way, that love had gotten buried beneath expectation and independence and adulthood's harsh edges. But the letter hadn't changed. The words were still here. The memories still lived in these objects. I hadn't imagined the bond we shared. It had been real, tangible, beautiful, and maybe, just maybe, the woman I had been then, the mother who made heart-shaped pancakes and laughed with her daughter in the kitchen, was still here too. I sat there for a long time, the letter in my lap, the pale blue fabric of my dress glowing softly in the lamplight beside me. I didn't feel whole yet, but I felt seen. Not by Sophie, not by anyone else, by myself, and that was the beginning of something new. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't feel like it was caving in. My eyes were swollen from sleep, not tears. I stood at the window and watched as the light began to spill across the rooftops. It was a quiet kind of beauty. No violins, no grand revelations, just the soft return of breath and thought and self. I made myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the warm mug like it was an anchor. Across the room, the shoebox still sat on the sewing table where I'd left it the night before. I didn't need to open it again. I could still feel the weight of that letter in my chest, as if those glitter-penned words had taken root in my ribs. Sophie hadn't always been cruel. She had once adored me, leaned on me, trusted me with every joy and fear. I hadn't imagined that life had just changed her. The world had changed her. Maybe I had too, and maybe, just maybe, I had changed myself. In trying to be everything for her, provider, protector, peacemaker, I had slowly whittled myself down to a shadow. I had allowed silence to take the place of boundaries. I had mistaken sacrifice for love and invisibility for grace. But I wasn't invisible. Not anymore. That quiet moment, coffee in hand, sun slipping into the room. That was my awakening, not a dramatic revenge fantasy, not a triumphant outburst, just clarity. It was time to stop waiting for someone else to see me. I saw myself now. After breakfast, I went back to my sewing room and stood in front of the dress. The pale blue satin looked different in the daylight, less ceremonial, more human, a garment not of shame, but of survival. I ran my hand along the hemline, then reached for my pincushion. I wasn't sure why yet. I just knew I wanted to finish it. Not for the wedding, not for Sophie, for me. As I worked, needle moving in and out of the fabric with the same rhythm I'd known for years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Calm power, not loud or flashy, the quiet kind that comes from doing what you love without asking for permission. I finished the hem, added a small lace detail at the neckline, pressed it gently with steam and care. Then I hung it on the wall like a painting. It looked beautiful, not because it was flawless, but because it was mine. Later that afternoon, I went into town. I picked up groceries. I bought a bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite, not Sophie's. I even stopped at the coffee shop near the train station and ordered a croissant and cappuccino and sat there alone, watching people rush past. It occurred to me somewhere between sips that I hadn't done this in years. Sat in public without purpose, just existing, just being. A young woman came in flustered and late, juggling her bag and phone. She smiled at me as she passed and said, "Love your blouse." I hadn't even realized what I was wearing, just something I'd sewn for myself last spring, yellow with tiny bluebirds stitched into the cuffs. "Thank you," I said, and smiled back, and I meant it. I wasn't healed, not completely. The hurt from Sophie's words, her choices, they still lingered, but for the first time, that pain didn't define my day. It didn't dictate who I was. I was beginning to reclaim my story, not as a martyr, not as a victim, but as a woman who had given much, lost much, and now, finally, was giving something to herself. When I got home, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the wind rustle through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That was the day I stopped waiting for someone else to make things right. That was the day I began to feel whole again, not because anyone else told me I mattered, but because I did. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Something had shifted in me, a thread pulled loose that unraveled everything I thought I knew about motherhood, sacrifice, and self-worth. I didn't storm into Sophie's life demanding apologies or explanations. I didn't post cryptic messages or tell family members what she'd done. I didn't burn the dress or delete the photos. I simply began preparing for what exactly I didn't know yet, but I knew this. I was done being the background. It started small. I logged into my bank account, pulled up every invoice, every receipt connected to the wedding. I organized them into a folder, not out of spite, but because I needed to see in black and white how much of myself I had poured into that day. The numbers told a story no one else had taken the time to read. Over $19,000, all paid without complaint. Every flower, fork, and rented chair funded by a woman who was made to feel like an afterthought. But this wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about drawing a line, not with shouting, but with action. I called the catering company again, this time to confirm the cancellation had gone through. The woman on the phone sounded surprised but respectful. "Do you need a statement for your records?" she asked. "No," I said after a pause. "I just needed to know I followed through." That same afternoon, I made another call to the local hospital where Richard had spent his final days. I spoke with the donation coordinator and asked about contributing to their hospice care fund. "I'd like to make a donation in memory of my husband," I told her, "and I'd like it to cover the cost of meals for the families in the ward for the next 6 months. There was a silence on the line before the woman responded. "That's incredibly generous, Miss Jennings." I felt a lump in my throat, but kept my voice steady. "It's long overdue." I wrote the check that night, signing it with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. That money was never meant to buy affection or proximity. It was meant to nourish, to support. If it couldn't do that in a wedding hall, maybe it could do it in a place where love still held its meaning. Next came the house. I'd lived in the same 2-bedroom cottage for nearly 30 years. Every creak of the floorboards, every scratch on the molding told a story. But for the first time, I realized I didn't have to stay. Not because I didn't love it, but because maybe it was time to build something that belonged to me now, not to the past. I scheduled an appraisal, contacted a real estate agent I trusted. I wasn't in a rush. I wasn't even sure if I'd sell, but I wanted to know my options. Just knowing I had choices felt like power. I also started sewing again. Not for clients, not for Sophie, for myself. I made simple pieces. A linen blouse, a tea-length skirt, a new pillowcase for the chair I always read in. I stitched with no deadline, no expectation, only the soft rhythm of fabric and thread moving through my hands, grounding me. One afternoon, I found myself in a bookstore downtown. I hadn't browsed for pleasure in years. I picked up a memoir by a woman who had rebuilt her life after losing everything in a divorce. I read the first chapter, standing by the window, then bought it without hesitation. As I walked home, book tucked under my arm, a man around my age smiled at me and said, "Beautiful day," and I smiled back. Not because I was hoping for anything, but because it was, and I could finally feel it. I never told Sophie what I was doing. I didn't reach out, didn't hint at the change. She was busy with her honeymoon, no doubt, posing on balconies and sipping cocktails in the Maldives. That was her world now, but mine, for the first time in decades, was mine alone, and in that silence, I wasn't waiting. I was becoming. It was a week after the wedding when the first message came, a short clipped text from Sophie. "The caterer says we didn't confirm. What happened?" I stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue message bubble hovering like a cloud that wasn't sure whether to rain or disappear. I didn't answer right away. I didn't feel the usual spike of panic or the urge to explain myself. I just placed the phone down and returned to the hem I was hand-stitching on a navy cotton wrap dress, the first piece I'd made entirely for myself in years. A few hours later, another text. "Guess we're upset. We look stupid." This time I did respond. I wasn't going to pay to be humiliated. There was no follow-up, not immediately, just silence. The same silence Sophie had gifted me in the weeks leading up to her wedding. Only now it hung on her end, not mine. That's when I felt it. Not triumph, not vindication, but balance. The scales, uneven for so long, were starting to level. Sophie had always been strong-willed, independent. I raised her to be that way. But somewhere along the way, that independence had hardened into entitlement, and I had let it. I had enabled it with every quiet yes, every unspoken boundary. Now, without confrontation or cruelty, I had said no, and that no echoed louder than any argument could have. Over the next few days, the ripple effects became visible. My cousin Elaine called and asked, "Is it true there wasn't any food at the reception?" I told her the truth gently. "Yes, I canceled the catering." A pause on the line, then softly, "Good." I didn't expect that, but it wasn't the only one. Gavin's mother, who'd once praised my dedication during early wedding planning calls, left me a voicemail I didn't bother replying to. She sounded rattled. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let's talk soon." I didn't return her call either. I wasn't being spiteful. I was simply done bending backward for people who only noticed me when they needed something. Even the wedding planner emailed me. She framed it as an invoice issue, subtly fishing for information. Just wanted to check. Was the cancellation intentional? There's been some confusion. I wrote back one sentence. It was intentional. No signature, no explanation. Each quiet, firm response seemed to carve out more space for me to breathe. One afternoon, I walked into the local grocery store and saw a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in months. She smiled at me across the produce aisle and said, "You handled that with grace, Mara." I blinked. "You heard," she nodded. "News travels. Honestly, I wish I'd had your courage." I didn't know how to respond, but as I walked away with a bundle of rosemary in my cart, I felt something I hadn't in years. Respect, not handed to me, but earned, reclaimed. I started to see my own face differently in the mirror, not younger, not smoother, but real and strong. The kind of woman who didn't make scenes, but made moves quietly, intentionally, even in my body. I felt it, the return of weight where numbness had been. I took morning walks again, this time, not just to clear my head, but because I wanted to feel the world beneath my feet. I planted herbs in the backyard, cleaned out the attic, donated boxes of old things I no longer felt the need to hold on to. One box was filled with wedding magazines, dog-eared pages Sophie and I had once flipped through together on the couch, dreaming up colors and table centerpieces. I paused before tossing them, not out of sentimentality, but out of gratitude for the mother I had been, for the dreams I'd once held. Then I let them go. That week, Sophie posted a picture on social media, a sunny beach captioned, "New Beginnings." No mention of the wedding, no family photos, just her in a white sundress looking out over the ocean. I stared at it for a moment, then closed the app. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt distance, the kind that protects, not punishes. She had her new beginning, and so did I. The difference was, mine was rooted in truth, and that truth, quiet as it was, had begun to shift everything. It was a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the wedding, when the knock came. I was in the garden, pruning the lavender bushes that had grown wild over the summer. The air was thick with warmth, and the cicadas hummed in the trees. I hadn't been thinking about Sophie, not directly. Her presence in my thoughts had become quieter, more distant, like a room I'd once lived in, but no longer needed to visit. The knock was firm, not hesitant, but not angry either. I stood slowly, brushed the dirt from my hands, and walked to the front door. It was her. Sophie stood on the porch, in sunglasses and a loose cardigan, her hair in a messy bun. She looked tired, not from travel or sun, but from carrying too many things she hadn't said aloud. I opened the door and stepped aside without a word. She walked in like she'd never been gone into the living room she grew up in, where her childhood photos still sat on the mantel. She glanced at the shoebox on the coffee table. I'd left it there, not by design, but because I'd been reading through it again that morning. She sat down. I didn't offer her tea. I didn't rush to fill the silence. She broke it first. I didn't think you'd actually cancel the catering. I sat across from her, folding my hands in my lap. You didn't think I'd do anything. That caught her. She looked away, adjusting the hem of her sleeve. I was overwhelmed, she said. The planning, the pressure, everything got out of hand. You made me feel like a stranger at your wedding. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and for the first time in months, she didn't look past me. I know, she whispered. I nodded, but I didn't rush to forgive. You made me small. You laughed at my dress, dismissed everything I did, and I stood there silent until I couldn't anymore. I didn't mean to humiliate you, she began. But you did, I interrupted gently, and you didn't stop. The silence stretched between us long and taut. I didn't think it mattered. She finally said, You never said anything. You always just did things. You always showed up. That was my mistake, I said quietly, teaching you that love means losing yourself. Her face changed then, softened, cracked at the edges. The fight drained out of her shoulders. I found your letter, I added. The one in the shoebox from when you were little. She swallowed hard. She once said, I made everything okay, that I look like a queen in this dress. I gestured to the blue gown now hanging, pressed and perfect on the back of the sewing room door. You meant it then. I was a kid, she murmured. You were honest, I corrected. Somewhere along the way, you forgot that version of me, but I didn't, and I won't forget myself again. She looked around the room, her eyes flicking across the old furniture, the worn armchair, the bookshelf we'd built together the summer before her freshman year of college. I didn't want to lose you, she said. You didn't lose me, I replied. You just stopped seeing me. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, the way she used to when she was little, and didn't want me to worry. I'm sorry, she said. Really, I believed her, but that didn't mean everything was fixed or that it needed to be. I'm not asking for an apology, I said. I'm asking for respect. You have it, she said quickly. I'm ready. I nodded slowly, not because everything was mended, but because something inside me said she meant it. I won't be your doormat anymore, I said. I won't be invisible. I'm not here to be managed or muted. I don't want that, she said. I want us. We sat like that for a while, the sound of rain softening everything. I opened the white box. The scones were warm, wrapped in parchment, dusted with powdered sugar. I passed her one and took another for myself. It wasn't a reunion. It was something quieter, a beginning. Sophie didn't stay long, just long enough to sip her tea, to breathe in the house that raised her, to promise something real, not with declarations, but with presence. When she stood to leave, she turned at the door. You look good in that dress, she said. I mean it. And this time, I knew she did. After she left, I sat back down, took another bite of scone, and looked out into the rain. I didn't need her to come back, but I was glad she did, and I was even more glad that I hadn't waited for her in order to feel whole again. The garden bloomed a little later that year. I noticed it one morning as I stood barefoot on the porch, my coffee warm between my palms. The lavender had begun to stretch back up from the soil, full and fragrant. The roses were just starting to bud. The air held that mix of dew and promise that only comes with spring. Everything was quiet, not the suffocating silence of being unseen, but the peaceful hush of finally being okay. Inside, the house felt different. Not because I had rearranged anything, but because I had, subtly, emotionally. I had taken down a few of the old wedding photos, not out of spite, just to make room. In their place were new things, a photo of the hospice center's staff holding a plaque with Richard's name on it, a handmade sign from the community center's event that read, "Thank you, Mara, for showing us the heart behind every stitch." And on the mantel, I had placed something small, delicate, the brooch, cleaned, polished, shining just a little brighter now. It didn't carry sorrow anymore. It carried strength, legacy, choice. The blue dress was no longer tucked away in a closet. It hung in the sewing room in a display frame I built with my own hands. The same dress that once stood for humiliation now stood for survival, for boundaries, for rebirth. Every thread in that dress told a story, not of shame, but of becoming. I spent more time in that sewing room these days, not rushing through projects, just creating for the sake of creating. I made a quilt out of fabric scraps I had saved over the years, pieces from Sophie's old school plays, from clients' weddings, from my own past life. I stitched them together without a pattern, just memory and instinct. It came out uneven in places. The corners didn't match perfectly, but when I ran my fingers across it, I felt nothing but peace. Sophie visited again not long after the rain had stopped. She brought fresh bread and a candle that smelled like orange blossoms. She didn't stay long, but we talked about her job, her marriage, even the letter Gavin had written. She asked if I still had it. I told her I did. There was no tension in her visit, no grand gesture, just presence, growth. She still had her sharp edges, her ambition, her independence. But now, there was space for me and her life, not as a utility, but as a person. We didn't talk about the wedding again. We didn't need to. Forgiveness had taken root in the quiet spaces between our visits, in the way she asked how I was, in the way I listened without bracing for disappointment. I no longer needed her validation. I had found my own. The biggest change, though, was internal. I began saying yes to things I had once quietly denied myself. Lunch with old friends, a weekend quilting workshop 2 towns over, a solo trip to the coast to sit on the sand and read a book with the wind in my hair and no schedule in sight. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to be reborn. I was simply trying to live fully, gently on my own terms. And I had never realized how much beauty there was in doing that. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror and pause, not out of vanity, but out of recognition. There I was, Mara, mother, widow, seamstress, survivor, whole. Not because everything had healed perfectly, not because life had returned to what it was, but because I had finally stitched together the pieces of who I was. Not just the mother of someone, or the wife of someone, or the planner of something, but myself, and that was enough. That was everything. I stepped back onto the porch, the breeze catching the hem of my skirt. The garden danced lightly in the wind, and I smiled, closing my eyes just for a moment. There would always be things I could not control, people I could not change. But I had changed myself. Not by losing who I was, but by finally remembering. And in that quiet final moment, I whispered something I hadn't said in years. I'm proud of you. The days that followed were quieter, but they were mine. The weight of the past, the years of sacrifice and silence, was slowly lifting, not all at once, but piece by piece. I didn't need grand gestures or apologies anymore. I had begun to rediscover who I was, not defined by the roles I had played, but by the woman I had always been beneath them. I kept sewing, creating things that mattered to me. I began to reframe the way I thought about the world around me, no longer as something to be endured, but something to be experienced. I went out with friends I hadn't seen in years, reconnected with old neighbors, and, slowly but surely, I allowed joy to seep back into my life. Sophie visited a few more times over the next few months. Each time, it felt a little different, a little less strained, a little more real. We talked about everything and nothing, about the weather, about my sewing, about her new life with Gavin, and Sometimes about the things we had both learned, the things we had lost, the things we were finding. She never mentioned the wedding again, and that was okay. I had learned that some things were better left in the past, where they belonged. What mattered now was that we had found a new space for each other, a quieter, more honest space, where we could be more than just mother and daughter. We could be two people, flawed and real, trying to understand each other in the mess of life. One afternoon, as I worked on a new project, a linen tablecloth that I planned to gift to Sophie for her new apartment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It was not the peace of perfection, but the peace that comes from acceptance. Accepting that things had unfolded as they did, accepting that the journey had been long, but had brought me to this moment. I didn't need to know what the future held. I had found contentment in the present, in the small things, in the feeling of thread slipping through fabric, in the warmth of a cup of tea, in the quiet hum of the sewing machine. The truth I had spent years trying to ignore had finally found its way to the surface, and it felt like breathing again after years of holding my breath. Sophie called one afternoon to tell me about a promotion at work. I listened with pride, but also with a sense of calm. She wasn't the little girl who once needed me to make everything okay. She was a woman, navigating her own path, and I was proud of her, proud of the woman she had become, just as I was proud of the woman I was becoming. As the seasons changed, I continued to sew, I continued to live, and I continued to honor the woman I had been, the woman who had loved fiercely, who had sacrificed deeply, and who had, at last, reclaimed herself. The garden bloomed again, the lavender growing tall and fragrant, and for the first time in many years, I could smell the sweetness of life and the strength of my own spirit. No longer would I be invisible. No longer would I stand on the sidelines, waiting for permission to exist. I had claimed my space, my story, and my peace, and in that quiet reclaiming, I had found the greatest love of all, the love of myself. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I woke up, the sun streaming gently through the windows. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to rush. I sat on the porch, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, the aroma filling the air. The lavender in my garden had bloomed beautifully, and the roses were just beginning to show their first petals. It was a perfect morning, calm, filled with the kind of peace I had once thought was beyond me. In that moment, I realized something important. The woman I had been, the mother, the caretaker, the one who sacrificed everything, was still here, but she was different now, stronger. She had found her voice, her boundaries, and the woman I was becoming was even stronger, more resilient. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, fully and authentically. I got up from the porch and went inside to check on the quilt I had been working on for the past few weeks. It was coming together beautifully, made from bits and pieces of fabric that held memories. Each scrap of fabric told a story, moments from my past, memories of Sophie, of the days we spent together when life felt simpler. I ran my fingers over the quilt, each stitch a testament to the resilience I had found in myself. Sophie came by a few days later, carrying a fresh loaf of bread and a jar of homemade jam. She didn't stay long, but we talked. Not about the wedding, not about the things we had lost, but about the things we had gained. We shared stories about the future, our hopes, our dreams. For the first time in years, I felt truly present in that conversation, not as a mother, not as someone who had to fix everything, but as a woman, simply being with her daughter. As Sophie left, she gave me a hug, a real one, not forced or awkward, but warm and genuine. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. The silence between us was no longer filled with tension, but with understanding. She had changed, and I had changed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was seen, not just as her mother, but as me, Mara, a woman who had rediscovered her strength. I watched her walk away, her figure growing smaller as she disappeared down the road. I felt something stir within me, a sense of pride, not just for Sophie, but for myself. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still moments when I felt the weight of the past, but I knew I was no longer defined by it. I had finally stepped into the life I deserved. And as I walked back to my sewing room, I couldn't help but smile. The pale blue satin dress, now carefully displayed in a frame, no longer felt like a reminder of humiliation. It was a symbol of survival, of change, of reclaiming my voice and my space. Each stitch, each fold of fabric, was a testament to the woman I had become, and for the first time, I was proud of the woman in the mirror, proud of the life I was building for myself step by step. The future was uncertain, but I no longer feared it. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that I had everything I needed within me. The love, the strength, the resilience, they were all mine, and they would carry me forward. With each new day, I knew I would keep sewing my own story, creating the life I had always wanted, not for anyone else, but for me. As the sun set that evening, casting a soft golden glow over the yard, I took a deep breath. Life was moving on, and I was moving with it, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in my own story, and that, I realized, was the most powerful thing of all. Sophie had found her way, and so had I, and for the first time in a long time, I was at peace with that. I didn't need to be anyone else. I was enough, just as I was, and that was something I would carry with me, always. This was a transformative journey for Mara, a story of reclaiming her voice, her self-worth, and her strength. If you've ever felt unseen or unappreciated, this story may resonate deeply with you. Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and let us know how you've reclaimed your own power. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this.